The carriage door slammed shut before Alira Hartley could say a single word to her mother. Through the small window, she watched Marion Hartley collapse into her husband's arms, sobbing into his shoulder while he stood stiff and silent, staring at the ground instead of at his daughter. The wheels began to turn. Gravel crunched under the horse's hooves. And just like that, the life Alira had known for 19 years was gone. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched her small stone cottage shrink into the distance until the winter fog swallowed it whole. Her chest felt tight, as if someone had wrapped a rope around her ribs and pulled it slowly, one breath at a time. She was not being sent to visit relatives. She was not being sent to work in the city. She had been traded, signed away on a piece of parchment her father had placed his mark on 3 days earlier, in exchange for enough gold to clear every debt the family owed, and enough grain to survive the winter that was already creeping over the hills. The man who now owned that parchment was Duke Reynard Colton, ruler of the northern province of Ashcombe, a man whose name alone made grown soldiers lower their eyes. Alira had never met him. She had only heard the stories, the same stories every child in the kingdom had grown up hearing. He crushed the rebellion at Merrill Hollow without mercy. He exiled his own cousin for daring to question him at court. He had not smiled in public since his brother died 5 years ago, and some said he had forgotten how. Alira closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Panic would not help her now. She needed to think clearly, the way she always had, ever since she was a little girl solving problems no one else in her family could solve. If she was going to survive whatever waited for her at Blackthorn Keep, she would need every bit of that sharpness. The journey took 2 full days. She slept sitting upright, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, waking each time the carriage hit a rut in the frozen road. On the second evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky the color of a dying ember, the carriage crested a hill, and there it was. Blackthorn Keep rose out of the mist like something carved from a mountain, rather than built by human hands. Its towers stretched toward the clouds, dark stone walls glistening with frost, and rows of narrow windows glowing faintly with candlelight. Alira had never seen anything so large in her life. Her village could have fit inside its courtyard 3 times over. The carriage rolled through the iron gates, and immediately she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Servants paused their work to watch the new arrival. A stable boy stopped brushing a horse mid-stroke. An older woman standing near the entrance crossed her arms and studied Alira the way one might study a stray animal that had wandered too close to the house. The carriage door opened, and a tall woman in a dark gray dress stepped forward. Her hair was pulled back so tightly, it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, and her expression was carved from the same stone as the walls around them. "You must be the Hartley girl," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am Bridget, head of the household staff. You will follow me and you will not wander. This is not your father's farm." Alira nodded, unable to find her voice. She stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking slightly into the frost-covered gravel, and followed Bridget through the enormous front doors. The inside of the keep was even colder than the outside, despite the massive fireplaces burning in nearly every hall. Tapestries lined the stone corridors, depicting battles and hunts and portraits of stern-faced ancestors who all seemed to be watching her pass. Alira kept her eyes forward, matching Bridget's brisk pace, memorizing turns as best she could, though she doubted she would remember them all. "You will be given a room in the East Wing," Bridget said without turning around. "You will not enter the West Wing under any circumstance. That is where the Duke keeps his private chambers and study. You will not speak unless spoken to in his presence. You will not ask him questions. Do you understand?" "Yes," Alira managed. Bridget stopped so suddenly that Alira nearly walked into her. The older woman turned, studying her with an expression that was almost pity, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Whatever stories you have heard about him, girl, forget them. And do not think for a moment that your circumstances here will be comfortable. You were brought here for a purpose. Best you understand that now, before you convince yourself of anything foolish." Alira swallowed hard and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had known from the moment her father signed that parchment exactly what kind of arrangement this was. She was not a guest, she was a payment. Her room, when she finally reached it, was larger than the entire first floor of her family's cottage. A narrow bed sat against one wall, a wash basin near the window, and a small wooden chest for her few belongings. It was plain, clearly not meant to impress her, but compared to what she had left behind, it felt strange and unfamiliar, like wearing a coat that belonged to someone else. She did not see the Duke that first night, nor the second. She began to wonder if perhaps he intended to ignore her entirely, leaving her to wander the halls of his enormous home like a ghost nobody wished to acknowledge. Part of her almost hoped that would be the case. On the third day, as the pale winter sun struggled through the clouds, Bridget appeared at her door without warning. "The Duke will see you now," she said, "in the main hall. Do not be late." Alira's stomach twisted into a knot as she followed Bridget through the winding corridors once more, this time toward the heart of the keep. The main hall was enormous, its ceiling so high that shadows pooled in the corners even at midday. A long table stretched down the center of the room, and at its far end, seated in a heavy wooden chair that resembled a throne more than a chair, sat Duke Reynard Colton. He did not look up immediately. He was reading something, a letter perhaps, his dark brows drawn together in concentration. Alira took the moment to study him before he noticed her. He was younger than she expected, though the lines around his eyes suggested a man who carried far more weight than his years should allow. His hair was black, cropped short, and his jaw was set in a hard line that seemed permanent, as though he had forgotten any other expression existed. When he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, Alira felt something cold pass through her, though not fear exactly. His eyes were a deep, storm gray, sharp and assessing, the eyes of a man who had learned long ago never to trust anyone at face value. "So," he said, his voice low and even, "you are the girl my new advisor arranged for me." Alira's chin lifted slightly before she could stop herself. "I have a name, my lord. It is Alira." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. Surprise, perhaps. It seemed few people spoke to him without trembling. "Alira," he repeated, testing the sound of it. "Do you know why you are here?" "To settle my family's debts," she answered plainly. "I am not foolish, my lord. I understand the arrangement." "Do you?" He rose from his chair, and though he was not an especially tall man, the way he carried himself made the space around him feel smaller. He walked slowly toward her, studying her the way a merchant might study a piece of cloth, checking for flaws. "Most girls in your position weep, or beg, or pretend affection they do not feel, hoping it will earn them favor." "I am not most girls," Alira said before she could stop herself. The Duke's eyebrow rose just slightly. For one brief moment, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing entirely. "No," he said quietly. "Perhaps you are not." He turned from her abruptly, walking toward the tall windows that overlooked the frozen courtyard below. "You will remain here. You will not be mistreated, so long as you follow the rules of this household. Beyond that, I have little interest in you. I have a kingdom's worth of problems, and a farm girl is not among them." The words stung more than she expected, though she refused to let it show on her face. "Then I will try not to become one," she said. He glanced back at her, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. "See that you don't." With that, he dismissed her with a single wave of his hand, and Bridget stepped forward to lead her away. As they walked back through the long corridor, Alira allowed herself, just once, to look over her shoulder. The Duke had returned to his chair, but he was not reading his letter anymore. He was watching her go, his expression unreadable, until the great doors closed between them. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed within the unfamiliar room, Alira stared up at the stone ceiling and thought about the man she had just met. Cruel, the villagers called him. Heartless. A tyrant who ruled through fear alone. But the man she had seen today, the one whose eyes had flickered with something almost like curiosity when she refused to be afraid of him, did not quite match the stories. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew, as sleep finally pulled her under, that her life at Blackthorn Keep was going to be far more complicated than she had prepared herself for. Outside her window, snow began to fall over the dark towers, soft and silent, covering the frozen ground in white. Somewhere in the west wing, behind a door Alira was forbidden to open, Duke Reynard Colton sat alone by his fire, staring into the flames, thinking of a girl who had looked him in the eye without a trace of fear, and wondering, for the first time in longer than he could remember, what exactly that meant for the walls he had spent 5 years building around his heart. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Alira rose early, before the rest of the household stirred, because the silence of those hours felt like the only freedom she had left. She would walk the edges of the courtyard when the guards allowed it, watching her breath curl into the cold morning air, memorizing the shapes of the towers against the pale sky. It became a small ritual, a way of proving to herself that she still existed as a person, and not merely as a debt paid in flesh. She did not see the Duke again for nearly a week. Bridget kept her occupied with small tasks around the household, mending torn linens, helping in the kitchens, tasks far below what a noble's ward might expect, though Alira suspected Bridget assigned them less out of cruelty and more to keep her too tired to think too deeply about her circumstances. It worked most nights. Other nights, she lay awake listening to the wind howl against the ancient stone, wondering if her parents ever thought of her, or if the gold and grain had already erased any guilt they carried. It was Bram, the Duke's aging gray hound, who first broke through the wall of silence between them. Alira found the old dog limping near the stables one frosty morning, favoring one paw, whimpering softly as he tried to walk. Without thinking twice, she knelt in the snow, checked his paw, and found a sharp thorn lodged deep in the pad. She worked it free gently, murmuring soft words the way she used to with the farm animals back home, and wrapped the paw with a strip of cloth torn from her own sleeve. She did not know the Duke had been watching from the stable doorway until she heard his voice behind her. "He does not let strangers touch him," Reynard said quietly. Alira startled, nearly losing her balance in the snow. She looked up to find him standing there, wrapped in a heavy dark coat, his breath fogging in the cold air. His expression was not the hard, guarded look she had seen in the main hall. It was something softer, something almost boyish, as he watched his old hound lean his weight gratefully against Alira's knee. "He was in pain," Alira said simply. "I couldn't very well leave him." The Duke crossed the courtyard and crouched down beside them, running a gentle hand over Bram's head. "He belonged to my brother," he said, so quietly Alira almost missed it. "Alden raised him from a pup. When Alden died, Bram would not eat for 11 days. I thought I would lose them both that winter." Alira said nothing, sensing that any word from her might close the door that had just barely opened. She simply continued stroking Bram's ear, waiting. "You are not what I expected," the Duke said finally, straightening. "Most people who come to this keep either fear me or try to flatter me. You do neither." "Should I be afraid of you?" Alira asked, tilting her head slightly. For a long moment he studied her, as though weighing how honestly to answer. "Many believe they should be," he said at last. "I have not corrected them." "Why not?" His jaw tightened. "Because fear is useful. Court is not a place for gentle men, Alira. Gentleness is mistaken for weakness, and weakness invites attack. I learned that lesson the hard way more than once." There was something in the way he said it, a weariness beneath the words, that made Alira suddenly see him differently. Not as the tyrant of the stories, but as a man who had built armor around himself brick by brick, year after year, because the alternative had cost him too much already. "My father always said a wall built too high keeps out more than enemies," Alira said softly. "It keeps out everyone." The Duke's gray eyes flickered toward her, something unreadable passing through them. He did not respond, but he did not walk away either. Instead, he remained crouched beside his hound, beside her, in the quiet cold of the morning, for far longer than either of them likely intended. From that day forward, small moments like this one began to accumulate, one after another, like snowflakes gathering into something greater than themselves. Alira began to notice things about the Duke that the rumors never mentioned. The way he rubbed his temple when court letters frustrated him. The way his shoulders dropped just slightly when he thought no one was watching. The way he always left food out for the stray cats that wandered near the kitchen, though he would deny it fiercely if anyone dared to mention it. She also began to notice things that troubled her. Certain servants who avoided her eyes when she asked innocent questions. Hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. A woman named Nora Finch, newly hired to assist in the record room, who seemed to appear in places she had no obvious reason to be, always watching, always listening, saying very little. One evening, as Alira carried a tray of mending back toward the servants' quarters, she overheard two guards speaking in low voices near the eastern stairwell. "Lord Drake's man was here again today," one muttered. "Third time this month." "The Duke doesn't know?" the other asked. "Of course not, and best it stays that way unless you fancy losing your position." Alira slowed her steps, straining to hear more, but the guards noticed her approach and fell silent, exchanging a wary glance before moving off in opposite directions. She stood there a moment, the tray growing heavy in her arms, turning the name over in her mind. Lord Drake. She had heard it mentioned once or twice at the dinner table, always in careful, measured tones, always followed by a subtle shift in the conversation, as though the name itself carried some unspoken danger. She resolved to ask Bridget about it the following morning, though when she did, the older woman's face tightened into something guarded and unreadable. "Lord Casimir Drake is no concern of yours," Bridget said sharply. "Court politics are not meant for kitchen maids and mending girls. Best you remember your place, Alira, before you find trouble you did not go looking for." But trouble, Alira was beginning to suspect, had already found its way to Blackthorn Keep, and it would not be so easily dismissed. As winter deepened, and the snow piled higher against the ancient stone walls, Alira's conversations with the Duke became less accidental and more deliberate. He began finding reasons to walk the same paths she walked in the early mornings. She began finding reasons to linger near the stables, where she knew he often visited Bram before beginning his long hours of court correspondence. Neither of them spoke of it directly, this quiet gravitational pull drawing them toward one another, but both felt it, undeniable as the changing season. One morning, as pale sunlight broke weakly through heavy clouds, Reynard found her sitting on an old stone bench near the frozen garden fountain, a book open on her lap, though she had not turned a page in several minutes. "You read?" he asked, genuine surprise coloring his voice. "My mother taught me," Alira said. "She said a mind left empty grows weeds instead of flowers." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first true smile she had seen from him since her arrival. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Alira said quietly, "before poverty wore the wisdom out of her and left only fear behind." The Duke sat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the winter chill. "Do you hate them?" he asked. "Your parents for what they did?" Alira considered the question carefully before answering. "I did at first. Now I think I understand it better. Desperation makes people do things they never imagined themselves capable of. It does not excuse it, but I understand it." Reynard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the frozen fountain, its water locked in stillness beneath a thin sheet of ice. "My father sold my sister's hand in marriage to a man 3 times her age when she was barely 16, he said finally. "For an alliance that fell apart within 2 years anyway. She died in childbirth before her 18th birthday. I have never forgiven him for it, though he has been dead for a decade now." Alira's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected this sudden unguarded honesty from a man the entire kingdom believed incapable of feeling anything at all. "I am sorry," she whispered. "So am I," he said. "It is why, when my advisor first proposed this arrangement with your family, I nearly refused outright. I did not wish to become the very thing I despised in my father." "Then why didn't you refuse?" His gray eyes met hers, something raw and honest flickering within them. Because my advisor showed me your family's circumstances, and I thought perhaps, if the arrangement was inevitable regardless of my involvement, it was better you came somewhere you would not be mistreated than into the hands of someone far worse. Alira stared at him, something shifting deep in her chest, some wall she had not realized she'd built beginning to crack at its foundation. That is not the reasoning of a cruel man, my lord. Perhaps I am simply better at hiding my cruelty than most, he said, though there was no real conviction behind the words anymore. I do not think that is true, Alira said softly. I think you have spent so many years convincing everyone else you are made of stone that you have nearly convinced yourself as well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind stirred the bare branches above them, sending a light dusting of snow drifting down between them like scattered stars. And in that silence, something passed between them, unspoken but undeniable, a recognition of two people who had both learned, in their own painful ways, how dangerous it could be to let anyone see them clearly. Neither of them yet understood how quickly that fragile understanding would be tested, nor how many watchful eyes within Blackthorn Keep were already waiting for the smallest opportunity to use it against them both. Spring arrived slowly that year, melting the snow in uneven patches across the courtyard, revealing patches of brown grass struggling to find life again beneath the retreating frost. With the change of season came a change in Alira's days as well. She was no longer confined to the kitchens and mending rooms. The Duke had quietly arranged for her to assist in the record room instead, a decision that raised more than a few eyebrows among the staff, though none dared question him directly. It was there, surrounded by shelves of ledgers and correspondence, that Alira first noticed how carefully Reynard carried the weight of his province. He was not the careless tyrant the villages whispered about. He read every petition personally. He remembered the names of farmers whose lands had flooded 2 seasons ago, and ensured their taxes were quietly reduced. He argued, late into the night, with visiting officials who wished to raise levies on families already struggling to survive the winter. You could simply sign what they put in front of you, Alira said one evening, watching him pore over a stack of papers by candlelight. It would be easier. Easier is not always right, he said without looking up. I learned that lesson at great cost. I do not intend to forget it. She found herself staying later and later in the record room, no longer purely out of duty, but because she had begun, without quite realizing when it happened, to genuinely enjoy his company. He spoke to her as an equal, something no one in her life ever had before, not even her own parents. He asked her opinion on matters of the province, and more surprising still, he listened to her answers. One evening in early spring, as the last light faded beyond the tall windows, Reynard set down his quill and rubbed his tired eyes. "Walk with me," he said suddenly. "I find I cannot think clearly indoors any longer tonight." They walked together through the quiet garden paths, where the first tentative buds of spring flowers were beginning to push through the softened earth. The moon hung low and full above the towers, casting silver light across the stone pathways. Neither spoke for a long while, content simply to walk side by side beneath the stars, the tension of the day slowly melting away with each step. "Do you ever wish for a different life?" Alira asked eventually, her voice soft in the stillness. "One without all of this weight upon your shoulders." Reynard considered the question for a long moment. "I used to. When I was young, before my brother died, before the province became my responsibility, I thought I might travel, see the ocean my mother always spoke of, live a quiet life somewhere no one knew my name." He paused near the frozen fountain, now trickling weakly with the season's first meltwater. "Now I find it difficult to imagine any life beyond these walls." "That sounds lonely," Alira said gently. "It was," he admitted, turning to face her fully. The moonlight caught the sharp lines of his face, softened now by something Alira had rarely seen there before. "Until recently." Her heart quickened at the weight in his words, at the way his gray eyes held hers without any of the guarded distance she had grown so accustomed to. "Reynard," she whispered, his name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue for the first time. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him despite the cool night air, close enough that neither of them could pretend any longer that the careful distance they had maintained for months meant anything at all. "I know what I am supposed to be to you," he said quietly. "A debt paid. An arrangement forced upon you by circumstances beyond your control. I have tried, these past months, to remain nothing more than that to you, because it seemed the honorable thing to do. And now," Illyria breathed, "now I find I have failed entirely," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Illyria did not step back. She did not look away. And when Renard lowered his head slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished it, she found she did not wish it at all. Their lips met beneath the pale spring moon, soft and hesitant at first, then deepening into something neither of them had words for, something that felt, for one suspended moment, like the entire weight of the world had lifted from both their shoulders at once. Neither of them saw the shadow shift near the garden wall. Neither of them noticed the figure who had been watching from the darkness for several minutes already, nor heard the soft, deliberate footsteps that retreated silently back toward the servant's entrance the moment the kiss ended. Nora Finch moved quickly through the shadowed corridors, her heart pounding with something that was not quite guilt, though it was not quite triumph either. She had been placed within Blackthorn Keep for exactly this purpose, to watch, to report, to wait for precisely this kind of opportunity. Lord Casimir Drake had been patient for many months, waiting for something, anything, he could use against the Duke he despised. Now, finally, she had it. She reached the small room where she slept, retrieved a folded parchment and ink from beneath a loose floorboard, and began to write, her hand steady despite the late hour. "My lord," she wrote, "I have witnessed something tonight that I believe will interest you greatly." 3 days later, in the grand receiving hall of his own, estate some 60 miles south of Blackthorn Keep, Lord Casimir Drake read Nora Finch's letter twice, then a third time, a slow smile spreading across his thin, angular face. He had waited years for an opportunity to weaken Duke Renard Colton standing at court, ever since the Duke had publicly opposed his appointment to the King's Inner Council, citing concerns about Drake's handling of provincial funds that had never been fully explained. "Well," Drake murmured to himself, setting the letter down upon his polished desk, "it seems our stone-hearted Duke has a heart after all. How very inconvenient for him." He summoned his steward within the hour and began drafting careful, deliberate plans. He would not act rashly. Rash actions could be traced, questioned, dismissed as mere gossip. No, this required patience, the same patience that had served him well throughout his long career of climbing the treacherous ladder of court politics. He would plant seeds slowly in the right ears at the right moments, allowing the scandal to grow organically until it became too large for anyone to ignore, least of all the king himself. Within 2 weeks, whispers began circulating through the royal court, carried by servants and minor nobles who had no idea they were merely pawns in a much larger scheme. The Duke of Ashcombe, they murmured, had taken advantage of a poor farm girl brought to his estate under a debt arrangement, using his power and position to force affections she could never have freely given. It was a twisted version of the truth, cruel in its inaccuracy, yet devastatingly effective precisely because it contained just enough truth within it to seem plausible. By the time the rumors reached Blackthorn Keep itself, they had grown far beyond anything resembling reality. Illyria first heard the whispered version from 2 kitchen maids who did not realize she stood within earshot, and she felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to a story that painted her as either a helpless victim or a scheming opportunist, depending on who was telling it, neither version bearing any resemblance to what she knew to be true. She found Renard in his study that evening, his face grim, a stack of urgent correspondence spread across his desk. "You've heard," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I have," he confirmed, not looking up immediately. "Lord Drake has been thorough, he always is." "What will happen?" Illyria asked, though she feared she already knew the shape of the answer. Renard finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something that looked distinctly like fear behind the careful control he always maintained. "Drake intends to use this to argue before the king that I am unfit to hold my seat on the council. that my judgment cannot be trusted if I would take advantage of my position over a girl brought here under obligation. It does not matter that it is untrue. Rumor rarely requires truth to do its damage. Then we must tell the truth ourselves, Elira said firmly, before Drake's version becomes the only version anyone remembers. Renard studied her for a long moment, something like admiration mixing with his obvious worry. The king rarely grants private audiences on matters such as this. And even if he did, Drake has powerful allies within the council who would use any appearance before the king as further proof of impropriety. Then we find a way regardless, Elira said, her chin lifting with the same stubborn determination that had first caught his attention months ago in the main hall. I did not survive being traded away like livestock only to let a man like Lord Drake write my story for me. A slow, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of Renard's mouth, the first genuine smile she had seen from him in days. No, he agreed quietly. I do not suppose you would. Securing an audience with King Edmund proved far more difficult than either of them anticipated. Weeks passed with careful letters sent through trusted channels, each one requiring patience neither Elira nor Renard felt they had left to spare. Meanwhile, Lord Drake's whispers grew louder, spreading from the corners of the court into the open, until members of the King's Council began openly questioning whether Duke Reynard Colton should retain his seat at all. It was Bridget, of all people, who finally offered a solution. The stern head of household had watched the growing crisis with quiet concern, and one evening she approached Elira in the record room, her usually guarded expression softened with something that looked almost like respect. "My sister serves in the royal household," Bridget said quietly. "She has arranged, through great difficulty, a private audience for you both 3 days from now. It will not be easy, and it will not be without risk. The king does not take kindly to being told his council has been deceived by one of its own members." "Why would you help me?" Elira asked, genuinely surprised. Bridget's jaw tightened slightly. "Because I have watched this household for 15 years, Elira Hartley. I have watched the Duke close himself off from every possibility of happiness, punishing himself for things that were never his fault to begin with. Whatever else you are, you have brought something back to him that I feared was lost forever. I will not stand by and watch Casimir Drake destroy that out of nothing but spite and ambition." The journey to the royal capital took 2 full days of hard travel. Elira spent much of it rehearsing what she would say, discarding one approach after another, terrified that a single misstep might not only fail to save Reynard's position, but could destroy them both entirely. Reynard, for his part, remained largely silent throughout the journey, his jaw set with the same grim determination she had seen the first day they met, though now she understood the fear hidden carefully beneath it. The royal palace dwarfed even Blackthorn Keep, its white stone walls gleaming beneath the afternoon sun, golden banners snapping in the wind atop towers so tall they seemed to pierce the clouds themselves. Elira had never imagined she would stand within such a place, and for a moment, the weight of where she was and what she was about to do threatened to overwhelm her entirely. King Edmund received them in a modest private chamber rather than the grand throne room Elira had expected, a decision she later realized was deliberate, a signal that this conversation would remain, for now, a private matter rather than a public spectacle. The king was an older man, his beard streaked heavily with gray, his eyes sharp and assessing despite his weathered face. "Duke Colton," the king said, inclining his head slightly. "And this, I presume, is the young woman at the center of quite a remarkable amount of court gossip." "Your Majesty," Elira said, curtsying as gracefully as her nerves allowed. "My name is Elira Hartley. I have come to tell you the truth of what has happened, in my own words, because I believe the version currently spreading through your court bears little resemblance to reality." The king studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to continue. Elira spoke carefully, honestly, describing her arrival at Blackthorn Keep, the months of careful distance the Duke had maintained despite the arrangement between them, the slow and genuine friendship that had grown between two people who had both learned, in different ways, the dangers of trusting too easily. She did not shy away from admitting the kiss had happened, nor did she try to paint it as anything other than what it truly was. A moment shared freely between two people who had come to care for one another, not the calculated exploitation Lord Drake had painted it to be. "I was traded to the Duke against my will, this much is true," Elira said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But everything that has happened since has been my choice, freely given. I will not stand by while Lord Drake twists that truth into something ugly for his own political gain." King Edmund listened without interruption, his expression unreadable throughout her entire account. When she finished, he turned his attention to Reynard. "You have remained remarkably silent throughout this, Duke Colton." "Because this is her story to tell, your majesty, not mine," Reynard said quietly. "But I will say this. I have known Lord Drake for many years, and I have watched him maneuver against every rival who dared oppose him, using whatever tools were available, truth or otherwise. I opposed his appointment to your council, because I witnessed firsthand the way he mismanaged funds meant for flood relief in the eastern provinces 2 years ago, funds that mysteriously vanished before reaching the families who needed them most. I believe this current scandal is nothing more than retaliation for that opposition." The king's expression darkened slightly at this new information. "That is a serious accusation, Duke Colton. One I can provide evidence for your majesty, if given the opportunity." For a long, tense moment, the king said nothing, weighing the accusations and counter-accusations laid before him. Finally, he rose from his seat. "I will require that evidence, Duke Colton, and I will require it soon. In the meantime, I will summon Lord Drake to answer for the manner in which this matter has been handled. Whatever the truth of your relationship with Miss Hartley, spreading deliberately misleading rumors to damage a rival's standing is not a matter I take lightly, regardless of how the underlying truth eventually settles." It was not the immediate resolution either of them had hoped for, but it was, Elira realized with cautious relief, a beginning. News of the king's summons reached Lord Drake within days, and it threw him into a controlled but simmering panic. He had not anticipated the Duke possessing evidence of the missing flood relief funds, evidence he had believed carefully buried 2 years earlier. He began scrambling to shore up his defenses, calling in favors from allies across the council, painting himself as the victim of a jealous rival desperate to distract from his own scandalous behavior. The court split rapidly into 2 camps. Those loyal to Drake, many of whom owed him political favors or feared his influence too greatly to oppose him, insisted the entire flood relief accusation was fabricated, a desperate counterattack from a duke caught in genuine wrongdoing. Those who had quietly resented Drake's rising influence for years, waiting for an opportunity to see him fall, rallied instead behind Reynard, eager to finally expose what many had long suspected but never dared to prove. Elira found herself caught in the middle of a political storm far larger than anything she had imagined when she first decided to speak the truth before the king. Nobles she had never met sent letters demanding she recant her testimony, painting her as either a foolish girl manipulated by a powerful duke or a cunning schemer who had orchestrated the entire scandal for her own advancement. Others sent letters of support, praising her courage, though she suspected many of these were motivated less by genuine concern for her and more by their own desire to see Drake finally brought down. Reynard, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to gather the evidence he had promised the king, sending trusted messengers to the eastern provinces to collect testimony from officials who had witnessed the missing funds firsthand, families who had suffered through that devastating flood without the relief they had been promised. It was dangerous work. 2 of his messengers reported being followed on their return journeys, and Elira spent many sleepless nights fearing that Drake's desperation might push him toward something far more dangerous than mere political maneuvering. The tension finally broke 3 weeks later, when the king summoned both Reynard and Lord Drake to appear before the full council, along with the evidence each side had gathered. Elira was permitted to attend, though she was instructed to remain silent unless directly questioned, seated in the gallery alongside Bridget, who had insisted on accompanying her for the ordeal. The council chamber was packed with nobles eager to witness the confrontation, the air thick with tension and whispered speculation. Lord Drake arrived first, immaculately dressed, his expression composed into practiced calm, though Alira noticed the slight tightness around his eyes that betrayed his genuine anxiety beneath the polished exterior. When Renard arrived, accompanied by 2 officials from the eastern provinces and a stack of carefully organized ledgers and testimonies, Alira felt her heart swell with something she could only describe as pride. He looked every inch the powerful duke the kingdom knew him to be, yet she alone, perhaps, understood the vulnerable, weary man who existed beneath that carefully constructed exterior. The proceedings stretched across the entire afternoon. Renard's evidence proved damning. Meticulously documented testimony from village officials describing funds that had been allocated for flood relief, but never arrived. Correspondence showing Drake's steward requesting unusual transfers around the same period. And finally, testimony from a former clerk in Drake's household who had grown disgusted enough with his employer's corruption to speak the truth, despite the obvious risk to himself. Drake fought back with everything he had, questioning the reliability of witnesses, suggesting the evidence had been fabricated or coerced, attempting repeatedly to redirect the council's attention back toward the scandal surrounding Alira and Renard's relationship instead. But with each passing hour, it became increasingly clear that the weight of evidence stood firmly against him, and the council's sympathy, once carefully cultivated in his favor, began shifting decisively away. By the time the sun began setting outside the chamber's tall windows, King Edmund rose to deliver his judgment, and the room fell into absolute silence. "Lord Casimir Drake," the king said, his voice heavy with barely restrained anger, "the evidence presented before this council today demonstrates a clear and deliberate misappropriation of funds meant to aid suffering families in the aftermath of tragedy. It further demonstrates that rather than face accountability for these actions, you chose instead to construct and spread a deliberately misleading scandal intended to destroy the reputation of a rival who dared to question your conduct. This council finds you unfit to continue serving in any position of trust within this kingdom." Drake's composed mask finally cracked, fury and desperation flashing across his face, as guards moved to escort him from the chamber, his protests echoing uselessly against the stone walls. Alira watched him go, feeling not triumph exactly, but a heavy, exhausted relief, the kind that comes only after surviving something far more dangerous than she had ever anticipated. The king then turned his attention to Renard, and by extension, to Alira seated in the gallery above. As for the matter that began this unfortunate chain of events, the king continued, his tone softening slightly, "I have listened carefully to both accounts, and I find no fault in either Duke Colton or Miss Hartley beyond the simple human matter of 2 people who found unexpected affection for one another under difficult circumstances. Whatever judgment the court may whisper on such matters, this council will make no formal finding against either of you." A wave of relief swept through Alira, so powerful she had to grip the railing before her to steady herself. Beside her, Bridget squeezed her hand tightly, something that might have been the beginning of a smile touching her stern features for the first time since Alira had known her. In the weeks that followed Lord Drake's disgrace and exile from court, Blackthorn Keep slowly began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home. The servants who had once watched Alira with wary suspicion now greeted her warmly in the corridors. Bridget, though still stern in her manner, began seeking Alira's company deliberately rather than out of mere obligation, the 2 women forming an unlikely but genuine friendship forged through the fire of shared crisis. Renard, too, seemed changed by everything they had weathered together. The careful distance he had maintained for so long, the walls built brick by brick over years of loss and betrayal, had crumbled entirely, replaced by an openness Alira suspected few beyond herself had ever witnessed. He laughed more easily now, a sound she had rarely heard during her first months at the keep, and he no longer flinched away from small moments of tenderness, a hand resting gently against her shoulder as they walked the garden paths, a soft kiss pressed to her forehead before he departed each morning for his duties. It was in the garden, beside the same fountain where their secret kiss had first bloomed into something neither of them could deny, that Reynard knelt before her one warm evening in early summer, the last golden light of sunset painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. "I once told you I had little interest in you beyond the arrangement that brought you here," he said, his gray eyes soft with something that looked remarkably like vulnerability. "I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. You walked into this keep with more courage than any noble I have ever known, and you have since taught me things about myself I spent years refusing to see. I do not wish for you to remain here as a debt paid, Alira Hartley. I wish for you to remain here as my wife, if you would have me." Tears gathered in Alira's eyes, though for the first time since her carriage had rolled away from her family's cottage all those months ago, they were tears of genuine joy rather than fear or grief. "I traveled here believing my life had been decided for me without my consent," she said softly, kneeling down to meet his gaze directly. "But everything that has happened since, every moment between us has been my choice, freely and completely given. Yes, Reynard, I will marry you." The wedding took place at Blackthorn Keep itself, beneath a sky so clear and blue it seemed the entire kingdom had paused to bless the union. King Edmund himself attended, a gesture that spoke volumes about how thoroughly the political tides had shifted since that tense afternoon in the council chamber. Even Alira's parents were invited, though the reunion remained complicated, filled with unspoken apologies and cautious forgiveness that would take years yet to fully heal, if it ever could entirely. In the months that followed, Reynard used his renewed standing at court to champion a change in the law that had first brought Alira to his door, a law that allowed families to trade their daughters and sons into arrangements to settle debts without any consideration for the child's own wishes. It was not an easy fight. Many nobles resisted, insisting such traditions had existed for generations and served an important economic function. But with Alira's own story as living proof of both the cruelty such practices could inflict and the genuine happiness that could still emerge from unexpected circumstances, the reform slowly gained support, eventually passing through the council in a session that Alira herself attended, seated now not in the gallery as a nervous witness, but beside her husband as Duchess of Ashcombe. Word of the reform spread throughout the kingdom, carried by travelers and merchants from province to province, until it reached even the smallest villages, including the one Alira had once called home. Families who might once have faced the same impossible choice her own parents had made now found other paths available to them. Protections that had not existed before one farm girl's courage reshaped the very foundations of how the kingdom treated its most vulnerable. Years later, when Alira and Reynard's own children ran laughing through the same garden paths where their parents had first fallen in love, the story of the poor girl traded to a cruel duke had become something else entirely throughout the kingdom. A story told not as a cautionary tale of desperation and loss, but as proof that even the coldest hearts, wrapped tightly enough in grief and fear, could still be warmed by honesty, by courage, and by a single, unexpected kiss shared beneath a springtime moon. Blackthorn Keep, once whispered about in fearful tones across the countryside, became known instead as a place of fairness and quiet justice, its halls no longer haunted by the ghosts of old cruelty, but filled instead with the warmth of a family built not from obligation, but from genuine, hard-won love. And though the kingdom would face many challenges in the years that followed, none who witnessed the transformation of Duke Reynard Colton, nor the remarkable strength of the girl who had once been traded away like a piece of property, ever doubted again the power that a single act of courage could hold over the fate of an entire kingdom.